Okay, so welcome everyone to today's talk. Towards a sustainable food future in China, customers' intention and policy implications. It is the 29th talk of a series targeting to promote agrobiotechnology and enhance understanding of the potential applications of agricultural products. We hope the series will inspire international scholars, researchers, farmers, and business in the agricultural field, as well as the interested public. First, let me introduce our speaker, Dr. Ming, who is an assistant professor at the Institute of Local Government Studies, the School of Government of the University of Birmingham. Her main research interests centered on public governance and risk regulation. Her current research focuses on the politics of regulation, regulatory regimes, and the globalization of regulation, especially in the context of less developed countries and the East Asia and Pacific region. With a passion for ensuring global food safety and promoting public health, May has further devoted herself to the cross-disciplinary research of food safety and security regulation. Her research outputs are published in top-tier venues, including Regulations and Governance, Policy and Politics, and Food Control. In this presentation, May will present a research on examining factors influencing customers' intention to purchase sustainable food in China. By conducting more than 2,000 surveys in 5 provinces spanning the north and the south of China, the results show that the traditional constructs of behavioral attitude, subjective norms, and perceived behavioral control and the additional construct of perceived quality are significant in inducing such intentions. She will further elaborate how to enhance customers' willingness to shift to sustainable food consumption by appropriate regulation and monitoring framework. Now let's welcome Professor Ming to the floor. Professor Ming, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Lam, for having me in today's talk. I would just want to take this opportunity to thank CUHK and the whole Ensure team for making this project successful. So in today's talk, I'm going to present a paper, which is actually a project when I was working in CUHK. And during that time, Professor Lam has invited some colleagues and also some colleagues outside CUHK to form an interdisciplinary team to conduct a project on agricultural food consumption. And during that time, we were successful to gain a grant, which is the Ensure grant, which helped us to collect the data. And after the completion of the project, we published papers, and one of the paper is this one, which was published on food and energy security. And this paper is about the future of sustainable food consumption in China. And this paper is open access. If you want to look at the full paper, please just click on the link of the paper. So in my talk today, I'm going to present this project and particularly the findings of this paper. So first, let's look at the background of this piece of research about sustainable food and agriculture. So as we know, food sustainability is one of the priorities of the global sustainability agenda, with UN Sustainable Development Goals highlighting food security and sustainable agriculture. Sustainable food and sustainable agriculture are the two related concepts that are increasingly important in today's world, where issues such as climate change, environmental degradation, and food security are becoming more urgent. Sustainable food refers to food that is produced and consumed in a way that is environmentally, socially, and economically sustainable. The production and consumption of the food should not harm the environment and should be done in a way that is socially responsible and economically sorry excuse me viable. And sustainable agriculture is the practices and systems used in food production that are sustainable in the long term. For example, using farming methods that do not damage the environment, such as avoiding the use of harmful pesticides and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It also involves promoting social equity and economic viability for farmers and farm workers, as well as ensuring food security for consumers. Both sustainable food and sustainable agriculture are important because they help to ensure that we can continue to produce and consume food in a way that is healthy for people and to the planet, both now and in the future. However, there are quite a lot of challenges to achieving sustainable food and agriculture. First, climate change. The changing climate patterns and extreme weather events have led to the loss of crops and livestock, affecting food production and supply. Second, land use and degradation. The conversion of natural ecosystems into agricultural land and overuse of land can lead to soil degradation, loss of biodiversity, and deforestation. Third, water scarcity. Agriculture is a major user of water resources, and water scarcity due to over-extraction, pollution, and climate change is affecting crop yields and food security. Also, we have the pesticide and ferticide use. The overuse can lead to environmental pollution, soil degradation, and health hazards. At the same time, we encounter food waste. There's been a significant amount of food that is lost or waste at different stages of the food supply chain, leading to economic loss and environmental impacts. We also have the lack of access to resources, especially for the small farmers, who constitute a large proportion of the world's food producers. But they lacked access to resources such as credit, land, and technology, which can limit their productivity and profitability. Finally, it is about the changing consumer preferences and behavior, which is the focus of this research. Consumers' preferences for food products and consumption patterns have a significant impact on the demand for sustainable agriculture and sustainable food. For example, plant-based diets are more beneficial to the environment compared to animal-based products. However, changing consumer behavior towards more sustainable food consumptions can be challenging. So that's why this inspires our research. So our research background is that global food production is expected to increase by as much as 1,010% by 2050, with most of this demand coming from developing countries, including China. And the growing demand for beef is of particular concern because bovine meat is associated with higher greenhouse gas emissions and intensive use of agricultural resources compared to other meat types. And China, as a rapidly developing economy and the most populous country in the world, is encountering challenges to sustainable food production. So we need efforts to maintain a sustainable food system and a change in consumer habits, such as a shift to a lower animal-based diet. And that inspired us to conduct this piece of research. So we look at the previous research and literature, and we find out the approach of sustainable food consumption, which advocates the responsibility to protect the environment and public health and to provide continued and reliable access to food. The previous work has proposed some solutions to food insecurity and unsustainability, and there are two ideas proposed by Garland. And these include the demand constraint and food system transformation. And these are the solutions that we are going to test in our project. Regarding demand constraints, there are two types. The first one is due to consumers' lack of awareness and knowledge about the environmental impacts of their food choices. This is because many consumers are unaware of the complex relationship between food production, processing, and distribution, and the environment. So as a consumer, just like me, when I went to the supermarket, actually, I didn't realize the environmental impact of the food that I consume. And the second type is related to the cultural and societal norms that shape our food choices. But these norms can be influenced by factors such as advertising, media, and social pressure, which often promote unhealthy and unsustainable diets. So it's time for us to make some changes. And there's also another need for a fundamental transformation of the food system to make it more sustainable. And this involves several key elements to transform the whole food system. First, shifting towards more plant-based diets. This is because plant-based diets have a lower environmental impact and require fewer resources to produce. Second, reducing food waste. Food waste is a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions and other environmental problems. Reducing food waste can therefore help to mitigate the environmental impact of the food system. But the question is how? Third, improving food production practices. This includes reducing the use of fertilizers and pesticides, promoting sustainable farming practices, and reducing the environmental impact of food processing and transportation. Here, we need some government support in terms of subsidies, for example. So the key research question of the project is, what factors influence Chinese consumers' willingness to adopt sustainable food consumption practices? And this study adds to the understanding of sustainable food consumption behavior by investigating the factors that motivate individuals' willingness to consume sustainable food. To answer the research question, this is the conceptual framework. The theoretical framework underpinning this research is the theory of planned behavior, TPB. And TPB is widely used social-psychological theory that explains human behavior, particularly on attitudes and beliefs influence behavior. It can be used to predict a range of behaviors, from health behaviors like exercise, smoking, diet, to social behaviors like voting or donating to a charity. The PPB posits that behavior is determined by three constructs: behavioral attitude, subjective norm, and perceived behavioral control. First, behavioral attitude refers to the individual's positive or negative evaluation of performing a specific behavior. Subjective norm is the social influence or pressure that an individual perceives from significant others to perform or not perform a specific behavior. These significant others could be peers, could be colleagues, or teachers, or family friends. And perceived behavioral control is the degree to which an individual believes they have control over performing a specific behavior, which means the ability, whether the individual perceives they have the ability to perform that behavior. And the TBB also includes the concept of intention, which is the motivational factor that drives behavior. So intention here is influenced by individuals' attitude, subjective norm, and perceived behavioral control. And TBB assumes that these three elements are the three main predictors of an individual's intentions, and therefore their behavior. In the past, including my own research, TBB has been used to study green consumption behaviors in Chinese consumers. So I use TBB to study green food in China and organic food in China, and also certified pork in China. But there has been a lack of coverage of sustainable food in TBB studies. And in my previous research, I also incorporate a new construct, which is perceived quality. And this construct can strengthen the predictive power of TBB. Perceived quality means consumers' judgment on the nutritional benefits and values of the food. And in perceived quality, trust is a key factor affecting consumers' PQ, perceived quality. Trust in terms of the certification system or the labels. So in this study, I measure the three traditional constructs in TBB and add perceived quality as the fourth construct as my contribution. And this study proposes four hypotheses related to the constructs and consumers' willingness to pay for sustainable food. I also suggest that these constructs may interact with each other in relation to consumers' willingness to pay. So this is the summary of the theoretical model. Four contrasts and how they interact or how they have direct effects on the behavioral intention. Based on the models, here are the key four hypotheses. First, consumers' behavioral attitude has a positive impact on their willingness to pay for sustainable food. This hypothesis suggests that the more positive consumers' attitude towards sustainable food, as measured by their concerns about environmental issues related to food production, the more likely they are to have the intention to consume sustainable food and be willing to pay for it. The second hypothesis is subjective norm has a positive impact on consumers' willingness to pay for sustainable food. And this hypothesis proposes that the influence from others, including government, media, experts, international organizations, and social media opinion leaders, can positively impact individuals' intention to consume and pay for sustainable food. The third hypothesis, consumers' perceived behavioral control has a positive impact on their willingness to pay for sustainable food. This hypothesis suggests that factors such as the cost of purchase, level of convenience in purchasing, recognizability of certifications, and conditions of purchase can influence individuals' perceived behavioral control and their intention and behavior to pay for it. The final hypothesis, consumers' perceived quality has a positive impact on their willingness to pay for sustainable food. This hypothesis proposes that consumers' judgment on the nutritional benefits and values of sustainable food, as well as trust level towards sustainable food certification, can positively impact their intention to consume and pay for sustainable food. So these are the 4 hypotheses. To test these 4 hypotheses, we collect our survey data in China by stratified sampling. So stratified sampling was used to select our respondents, with the number of urban respondents double that of rural respondents to represent the population distribution of China. Data was collected using a face-to-face survey in 5 Chinese cities, including Beijing, Nanchang, Xi'an, Taiyuan, and Shenyang in July to August 2019. And these cities are highlighted here. And these cities represent different income levels and economic disparities in China, with 1 rural and 1 urban district selected in each city. And respondents were randomly chosen based on their addresses, and if they were inadequate respondents, researchers visited public areas frequently visited by residents and randomly invited them to participate in the survey. The questionnaire was designed based on the previous studies and identified various manifest variables as indicators to measure the 5 latent variables in the model through direct observation and measurement. So the latent variables were the 5 variables that are presented in the models. And each latent variable, we need some measurements. So these measurement variables, or how we call the manifest variables, were all measured using a 5-point Likert scale. And in this figure, which shows our measurement or manifest variable. So here on the left-hand side are the valid measurement variables, which we used to measure these latent variables. And the survey consisted of 2 parts. The first part asked about different dimensions related to the latent variables, while the second part asked demographic questions. And each interview lasts for 20 to 25 minutes, depending on the age group of the respondents. Some elderly, they may need more time to complete the survey, but for the younger generation, they could just complete the survey quicker. And before the questionnaire, the researchers familiarized respondents with the concept of sustainable food and production. So we make sure that the respondents have some basic knowledge or background about the concept of sustainable food. Of the 2,492 questionnaires collected, 7 were invalid and 2,422 were included in the analysis. Here are the results. First, the descriptive statistics here. So this table is a bit too long, but this table shows respondents' demographic information, including their gender, age, living area, education level, employment status, family size, family income, and the ages of young family members. So why do we need to ask whether they have young family members? Because the previous literature told us that for families who have young members under 18, and especially for those younger than 6, the family the parents, they tend to be more prudent when they choose their food for the family, because the children, there will be a higher risk impact on their health if they consume unhealthy or unsafe food. And that's why a family with young members, they tend to be more prudent when they choose their food for the family. The sample of the study mostly matches the Chinese population, except for gender ratio and employment status, which are actually interrelated. So in the sample, 35% were men and 65% were women. So resulting in a ratio, the gender and men to women ratio is lower than the whole population. So the discrepancy can be explained by the fact that women are more likely to take responsibility of housework in China. And in our survey, they are categorized as unemployed or retired. And these unemployment women who had a higher chance to stay at home or go out for shopping, therefore, they were more likely to be selected for the survey because they were at home or they went out during the daytime, so they were more likely to be selected. We realized the discrepancy and we did some assessment, and we believe that this discrepancy is acceptable because the responsibility for food purchasing usually falls on women or the retired in China, whose perspectives, intentions, and behaviors of food purchase are highly valued in the study compared to other groups. So we find the discrepancy acceptable. So overall, the sample is representative of Chinese consumers across the country. So here is one of the important findings. It's about trust, about the respondents' level of trust in different food certification bodies. So trust is a key factor that influences consumers' intention to purchase sustainable food. However, the lack of trust between consumers and certification bodies can lead to different purchase choices. And this table shows respondents had a high level of trust in food certification bodies. And within the 3 certification bodies, which include international organizations, China's central government, and local universities and scientific institutes, the respondents presented highest trust towards the central government, although similar percentages for the 2 remaining bodies. So there has been a high level of trust or increasing level of trust. But when we look at other countries, we also find that Chinese consumers in general have a lower level of trust in food certification compared to consumers in other countries. For example, in Greece, 75% of consumers trust the institutions certifying food products. And in Malaysia, 86% of the consumers trust the certified bodies. But in China, around 54 to 55% of the consumers, they trust the certifying body. But what we want to emphasize is that Chinese consumers' trust towards the certifying bodies have been increasing since 2015. So for my previous studies, I just find that there were around 35%. And the latest study, I find 40%. And in this study, it is much higher, which is 55%. So we can observe there has been an increasing trend. One of the reasons is that in the recent years, the Chinese government have devoted much more resources to combat or to reduce the food scandals or the fake food labeling. So you can see in recent years there has been less scandals in terms of food safety in China. So that actually helps to build the confidence and trust of consumers towards the food regulatory system. So before conducting the analysis, we performed the reliability and validity tests, confirmatory factor analysis, and the model fit measurement, which indicates that our survey has good reliability and validity, and the latent variables can measure what we wanted to measure. And there has been good adequacy of the manifest variables in explaining the constructs, which means the design of the survey is reliable. And overall, there has been a well-fitting, this is a well-fitting model overall. So we have the confidence and we conducted our analysis. So we use structural equation modeling for analysis. And the results here in the table, which is difficult to understand, I know, but this table just tells us that the four hypotheses proposed in the study were all supported, which implies that the four constructs can predict the intention and the behavior of sustainable food consumption. In particular, the construct of behavioral attitude, which means concerns about environmental impact of food production, had the most positive effect on consumers' willingness to pay more, which means the respondents who have higher concern about the environment or who have more or higher environmental values, they tend to buy or purchase sustainable food. Second, subjective norms also have a positive impact. And subjective norms means the information from media, experts, and social media opinion leaders. So the information shared by this group has a positive impact on consumers. And perceived quality, which means the perceptions of health benefits and nutritive value of sustainable food, it also has a positive impact on the willingness to pay for sustainable food. So in terms of PBC, which is the perceived behavioral control, because we use the difficulty assessing food in our survey, and that's why we had a negative effect on willingness to pay, which implies that the respondents, if they find it difficult to assess sustainable food, because sustainable food is not that popular in China, so they are available in some big supermarkets, but not everywhere. So that's why for some respondents, they find it difficult to access to sustainable food. And that's why when they have higher difficulty, they have less willingness to pay for sustainable food, which makes sense. And we also find that there are interactions among the variables, and they are also positively correlated. So, excuse me. So what's the result? So what do the results tell us? So previous research on purchasing intention of consumers towards certified food, green food, and organic food mainly considers consumers' personal health concerns. However, in this study, the focus on sustainable food considers more about pro-environment values and behaviors of consumers. In other words, while the former research, including my own research, which focused on green food and organic food, and they are more related to individual benefits, especially the health benefits. But in this research, it inclines to prioritize collective interests such as the well-being of the future generations and the environment over individual interests. So this is the novel point of this piece of research. And unlike previous findings, this research suggests that consumers trust government certification the most and thus willing to pay more for government certified sustainable food. And the level of trust among the respondents was even higher than that in international organizations. So in the past, the previous study told us that Chinese consumers tend to trust the international organizations more in terms of certification. But nowadays, the Chinese consumers tend to trust the central government, the Chinese central government more. So like what I suggest, because in the recent years, the Chinese government has devoted lots of resources to protect the reputation of the regulatory regime in China. And this is the results that we can see. Among the 4 constructs in TPP considered in this study, behavioral attitude contributed the most to the respondents' willingness to purchase sustainable food. So in this study, attitude referred to their concerns about the impact of food production on the environment, like the drying lakes and rivers. In other words, consumers with high behavioral attitude are highly concerned about the impact of their food consumption on the environment, rather than simply considering personal benefits such as food safety. So this group of people, they limit their demand for non-sustainable food and replace their needs with sustainable alternatives. So I find it interesting because in this sense, this finding is consistent with studies suggesting that these consumers are more likely to be socially concerned rather than individually concerned. So they are willing to spend extra for sustainable food. So this is also very similar to the idea of green consumerism. So it's similar to buying fair trade products like fair trade coffee beans, from which consumers derive no extra benefits in terms of food quality, or even they may actually have to face extra cost on the consumption. Despite this asymmetric relationship, consumers are still satisfied with such expensive purchases. So this is something encouraging here. So in terms of perceived quality, it was also found to have positive impact on food choice. And this factor was measured by the respondents' perceptions of the health benefits or nutritive value of food products. And this finding aligns with studies showing that when it comes to food choice, food safety is often one of the main considerations. However, healthy food means more than just being safe to consume. So other than causing no harm, consuming healthy food may improve health. So this concern about healthy food can also translate into behavioral attitude towards sustainable food, as consumers may consider that the long-term supply of healthy products can be achieved through sustainable food consumption. So our finding on the interaction between the 2 constructs also supports such a correlation. And that interaction can be two-way. So on the one hand, consumers may perceive a clean environment as an enabling condition for growing quality food, as they become more concerned about the health benefits and nutritional value of their food. On the other hand, consumers may also become more observant of the ingredients used in their food as their concern for the environment increases. So overall, consumers concerned about food safety and quality may be more easily convinced to pay more for sustainable food. Finally, as predicted by TPP, perceived behavioral control influenced the respondents' willingness to pay, and this variable measured the convenience with which the respondents could purchase different types of food. And sustainable food in China is new, so it is therefore not widely available. So this type of food may be more easily found in larger supermarkets and stores that sell a variety of products. And people who have less access to different types of food have less intention of consuming sustainable food. And this finding is similar to that of previous study, who find that low availability of organic food also hinders consumers' purchase intention. So the conclusion here for this piece of research, so the study is novel in the sense that it has examined the extent to which consumers are willing to pay more for protecting the environment. And because the sample is drawn from 5 provinces covering rural and urban areas, making it more representative than other studies. So we are confident that the findings could be generalized to a wider population in China, as well as countries or regions with similar context in the world. In terms of policy implications, and here are some directions. So to address the demand constraints, there is a need for greater public awareness campaigns, education programs, and policy interventions that incentivize sustainable food choices. And our findings show that perceived quality and subjective norms have a positive effect on inducing sustainable behavior. So this implies that disseminating information about sustainable food by trustworthy parties such as the government, the media, experts, and social media opinion leaders could create social pressure, which is the subjective norms, and ultimately affect the intention and behavior of consumers. In other words, instead of relying on the government only, the government can also cooperate with those media experts and social media opinion leaders to ensure that messages on sustainable food or sustainable development are promoted in various ways. In other words, we need to rely on the subjective norms, which are the influence and pressure of the significant others. And the final policy implication is that a relatively lower level of trust in food certification in China is also worth exploring, because some environmentally conscious consumers might be reluctant to spend more if they are uncertain of the food packaging claims. But consumers' trust in sustainable food is a long-term accumulation process, and regulation and its monitoring framework may also affect consumers' trust towards sustainable food. Therefore, future studies may also need to explore the effective strategies to communicate the concept of sustainable food effectively, instead of just using the label, and to make sure consumers understand the label and the logic behind, and this can promote their intention to consume sustainable food. So this is the final implication. And that is for my presentation. And I welcome any questions. And if you have any inquiries or you want to discuss the papers, just feel free to email me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So I think that's a question by Robin in the chat box, right? So Robin, why don't you ask yourself? Yeah, Why don't you unmute yourself and ask directly?
Thank you, Dr. Lin. Thank you, Professor Lin and Professor Meichu. How charming you are! So young and so knowledgeable and committed to sustainability. Very impressive. Your survey has touched on many grounds, and you have coordinated with a lot of people to get it done. Really, very salute to you.
Thank you so much.
I as a curious bystander, is there a difference between paper survey, something that we receive, that we fill out anonymously, compared to somebody who talks to you face to face? We expect people to answer honestly, but is there a difference? Just aside.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for the really great questions. And I often love to talk about doing survey and the difficulties. And thank you for giving me this chance to elaborate a bit about how the survey was done. You are making a very good point that face-to-face interviews, sometimes we have some interaction or interventions from the external parties, like the environment and also the role of the researchers. So sometimes even the researcher smile or not to smile will actually affect the answers of the respondents. And that also applies to in-depth interviews. So our protocol is to minimize the role of the researcher or the impact of the researcher in conducting the survey. So in terms of this questionnaire, what we did is that we just actually gave the survey or gave the paper to the respondents, and they could just complete themselves. And the researchers were just standing at just side, not looking at the respondents. But if the respondents, they really have the questions, they can just ask the researchers for clarification. But actually for our respondents, many of them were actually from the village, from the really rural area of the villages. And they were actually not able to read the surveys. So what we did is that we have to read out the questions. And therefore, we have a lot of trainings before the data collection process starts. So we make sure that the researchers, they are well trained to conduct the surveys. But still, we also realize there could be some impacts of the researcher. And that's why in a survey, we often have some questions which are repeatedly asked in different parts of the survey. So actually, like number 1, that question actually is just the same as the number 15 questions, but we ask in another way that the respondents may not really realize. And we did a survey data analysis. We will double check the 2 questions, number 1 and number 15. And to see whether the questions and the answers are consistent. And we have quite many checking questions there. But if we consistently find that the answers of the 2 pairs, they are not consistent, and we have the confidence to say that, okay, the respondents may just randomly answer the questions without careful thought, and we may just make that survey invalid. And that's also the reason why we had 70 invalid questionnaires there, and that we have to exclude from our analysis. To answer your question about the online survey, so online survey is obviously more anonymous, and the respondent just can feel free to fill in any time, and they tend to answer the questions more frankly because the impact of the researchers is reduced. But we also encountered many problems or challenges for online surveys, because we sometimes question whether the respondents were really answering the questions, or were they really having a careful thought before answering the questions, because that's online. And to mitigate the problem, again, we use some measures. So like the pairing questions checking, or we will actually look at how much time the respondents spent on the surveys. And also when we did the analysis, we will check for consistency. And that's why we have the reliability and also the validity check. So I would say both sides, the face-to-face and the online surveys, have their own pros and cons. And that's why when we design the survey, we have to do the pilot study and to test which set or which data collection methods are more reliable and decide on which kind of methods that we should use. And again, we try to develop some remedies in order to address the problems. So I hope I answered your questions. Great, thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so yeah, so we'll entertain the next question. See whether I have any friends who would like to ask a question to Professor Mei Chu. Then I ask a question because I always have this question in my mind. Right? So handling a big populated country like China, right? So sampling is always my question. So how could you estimate the error margin of the sampling? I mean, is there any standard way that you can perform survey without too much error? Because the sample could be biased, right?
Yeah, yes. So we performed like random sampling, and we actually thought about different ways of the random sampling. So it could be just random sampling, simple random sampling. It could be stratified sampling. It could be cluster sampling. So there could be many methods. And we also need to consider the resources that we have, or the limitations that we have. And online survey is often the cheapest way to conduct a survey because we just pay for the online platform. And the online platform, actually, they recruit a significant number, which is a really big pool across the country, and guarantee that the respondents or the members in the polling platform actually covers all people or the population in the country, including the geographically or in terms of education level and income level. So when we pay for the polling company, we could specify our criteria, like how many of the respondents have to be from this region or from which region, and how many of them have to be like from that education level or income level. So we just based on the population or based on the census in order to design the specification. So that's the way what we did in online survey. And online survey is increasingly more popular because the pool there actually cover the whole different characteristics of the population. But at the same time, the online polling company also have their own problem. Like they do not have enough older generation. The pool of older generation, they may not be signed up with the polling company because they just do not get access to the internet. And also for the really rural area, they also don't have the access to the internet. So they may not be able to sign up as members of the polling company. So that's why we didn't choose the way of using online survey, although it was claimed to be more representative, to represent the whole population, that we could address that. So therefore we just tried to manually choose the place that we conduct the survey. And after some considerations, we think education level or the place there where people live and the income level are the three most important factors that affect the purchase behavior. So that's why we intentionally chosen the provinces which are richer poorer, and we also try to pair up a city with urban district and rural district to make sure that they cover the area. So in this sense, even though the samples, our samples could not represent the whole country, at least we are confident that the key characteristics are covered in our samples, including the location where they are, the income level, and the education level, because they were deemed as the most important factors affecting the survey results of our study. And that's why we use stratified sampling. And here we use stratified random sampling there in order to choose which city and then which district. And of course, after collecting the data, we try to compare the descriptive statistics with our census, the Chinese census. And that's why we also observe some discrepancies. And that's what you said, there could be bias. And we also observe some bias. And the bias is about the gender. And actually, the gender is related to the employment status as well. And we had more women than men. So what is the next step? But because anyway, we collect the data, there were just two choices: to abandon the whole data set and try to use another method to do it again, but it will be super expensive. So we try to assess it using different measures, and we read also the previous studies, and we try to make sure that that samples could still be used. Then we got the conclusion, we had a discussion and got the conclusion that, okay, even we had more women, would it actually affect the aim of our study? And we discussed and we conclude it may not, because we actually wanted to study the consumer behavior of food. And we can imagine in a family in China, most likely it's the women and the retired people who purchase food for the whole family. If it is a family, it's a family of 3 or 4, it's more likely to be the retired, or most likely women take more responsibility in terms of housework. So even though we have more women in our survey, it's not ideal, but it's still acceptable because we want to study the behavior of the consumer, and the consumers are likely to be women in the context of China. And that's why we perceive the sample as reliable, and we continue our study. So this is the way that we make sure that the sample is representative enough. Okay. But in terms of the data, we of course we conduct some tests like reliability and validity tests, but that is not really about the sampling. So I hope I answer your question.
Thank you very much. So is there any other question from the audience? Yes, McGill. Can you unmute yourself?
Hello, good morning, Dr. Tam. Well, I'm Miguel, as you know me, from Panama. Yeah, I have a question made about the title of your presentation about the sustainability of the food in China. The question is it a particular situation for China, or the sustainability of food is an issue for other nations too?
Yeah, thank you for the question. This actually is a really great one. And Professor Lam, you still, when we developed this project, we actually wanted to study more countries. So we actually also have the same project, a similar project within the UK, studying the British consumers' behavior. And after doing the Chinese consumers studies, we also have the survey, which is an online survey that we did in Korea. And we also conduct a similar survey in Vietnam. So actually, this is a project which is much bigger than what I presented today. So we tried to compare the different countries, the consumers in different countries. I would say We focus on China because like the background is that because it's the most populous country in the world, and the idea is still quite new in China about sustainable food. But in the UK, that idea has been there for a much longer time. So the consumers, they may be more like acceptable, more open to this idea. So we hope to publish other papers which incorporate the different countries and have a comparison and have a chance to make another presentation of the project. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, May. So we did Vietnam and Japan, right? Or Korea. I forgot Japan or
I forgot.
Korea.
Is it?
This is Japan, right?
Japan? Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it
So,
Japan? I forgot
yeah,
it's Korea.
yeah,
Oh, you
yeah.
went to Korea.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's Japan. Sorry,
So
I mixed up.
I think we have tried to do 3 different Asian countries. One is supposed to be more developed like Japan. One is emerging economic power such as China, and then there is a developing country that may follow the footsteps of China. That is Vietnam. So that's why we want to see a trend of these Asian countries to see how they develop the sense of food safety and environmental sustainability. Because I think in Western countries there are many similar study has been done, but there's much less in Asian countries. So our bigger aim is to address something bigger, but it's more difficult because data is more heterogeneous. So for example, when we do the online survey, right? So the bias is different from what we are doing for face-to-face. And in Vietnam, actually, we are interviewing the people on the street in front of the supermarket. So yeah, we need to settle some of these heterogeneity of the data first. Yeah, but it is interesting. So is there any other question from the audience you would like to share? Okay. Now, if not, let me do an advertisement. So I will share a screen to show you the next talk. Okay, so the next talk will be more academic. Okay, so it is by Professor Xin Dawei from Northeast Agricultural University. He will talk on some rhizobium soybean interactions, especially about the type 3 effectors. So I have asked him to talk in more layman terms so that more people can understand. So let's see how he will prepare his presentation. All right. Okay. So with that, I really thanks everybody for by joining. And now let's say goodbye for now. And in April 21st, we will see each other again. And I hope that this kind of meeting can someday be held face-to-face instead of all by Zoom, right? So maybe we organize one, inviting all the guests to come to Hong Kong and then have a cup of coffee and listen to some talks, right? Okay, so good night and goodbye, everybody.
Thank you
See
so
you.
much.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.